a sweet girl named Larita was sent to a secret fiancé as a wife. Her unhappy life became even worse until the Duke returned. As soon as the girl saw how her father and his daughter were looking at her, she understood that she was being sent to her death. But she should always smile and be grateful for everything. But soon her husband died on the battlefield, and everything began to take a completely different turn. Her sister simply hated her and could even allow her to raise her hand against her. But one day the heroine couldn't take it anymore and was ready to stand up for herself. Larita couldn't control herself anymore and stopped. She continued to hit her sister back. Of course, her father didn't like this at all and considered her an ungrateful child. Meanwhile, the older sister begged her father to order Larita to be beaten to death. But she was not at all prepared for the fact that everyone could beat her, so she bit his leg with all her might. She was very angry with everyone, even just hated them. Her older sister should have married Duke Lionheart. She fell in love with him at first sight and insisted on marrying him. But when he returned after winning the war, he found himself killed by his captives. But first, he chose as his wife not Larita's sister, but a girl of unknown origin. Not much has passed since then, and many traitors immediately began to appear, as well as betrayals by the Duke himself. All his property was seized, and only one worthless estate remained, which was located in a dark forest. She understood that no one had been there for quite some time, and everything around was dirty. But she was actually happy to have her own house. The view from the window was quite good, and the roof seemed very sturdy too. The girl knew that right now everything was going to be completely different. But we had to prepare everything so as not to spend the winter in the cold. But if we try hard, spring should come soon. The heroine's sister, Rosa, was still in grief over the death of the Duke and could not come to her senses. But since everyone considered him a traitor, now it was no longer possible to talk about him. Rose could not forget her lover and did not even consider the fact that she could not remember him. The day they met, she knew at first sight that he was her destiny. Her father tried to calm her down, as there are many unexpected events in life, but they were happy that they managed to get rid of the girl whose father had brought to their house. The family gradually began to quarrel. The father could no longer control his emotions. He hit his wife hard on the cheek. Blood started flowing, and the maids didn't know what to do. The man immediately warned that he needed to be careful with his words. Rosa didn't understand why her father immediately became so aggressive when it came to Larita. The girl immediately remembered how her father had once brought Larita to their estate when she was still little. Rosa immediately began to be jealous of the other girl for her father, but she had to come to terms with it. Her parents said that she was the older sister and had to teach her younger sister everything. Rosa was very worried about her father and tried to calm him down, but all his thoughts were only about Larita. But in the meantime, Larita was actually doing well. She was quietly doing household chores. She was thinking all the time, and only thoughts about the past came to her mind. But nothing good came of it. At that time, she only had a couple of potatoes and some seasoning, but there wasn't much she could cook with that. But since she was human, she knew that she needed to eat 3 times a day. When she returned, she realized that there was a lot that could be sold, but she didn't know how to get everything to the village. Larita was in despair and didn't know what to do, but everything wasn't so bad for the first step in a new life. As soon as she took out the potato, it was still steaming, but she hoped it was delicious. The young lady was so hungry that she didn't even care that the potatoes were very hot. At that moment, she thought that everything would be much better if she could wash this deliciousness down with milk. But her thoughts were also about her mother, who had ruthlessly abandoned her when she was little and ran away. The Count immediately accepted her, and the girl decided that all those people were good. But very soon everything turned out to be wrong. The girl was treated badly. But she found the strength to pull herself together and adjust to the better, because the house was there and she just had to get used to it. Within a few days, things started to get better. The people in the village turned out to be very kind. She now had everything she needed to plant a garden and decided not to delay. Now everything around her began to improve. The house was cozy and clean. Suddenly, her peace was interrupted by a sound. It sounded like a door opening, so it was a little scary. She decided that she needed to protect herself and the house, so she dared to look. But there was no one in the house, but stupid thoughts did not leave her head. As soon as she opened the door to make sure no one was there, a man appeared in front of her. He had no strength at all from his injury and fell right on top of her, constantly muttering something about himself. Larita did everything she could, but she couldn't even find out his name. She was taking care of him all the time, trying with all her might to warm up the air in the room. But looking at him, she was not at all sure that he would be able to survive the coming night. The girl felt like everything was starting to turn against her. She didn't know what to do next. It seemed to her that the young man was definitely a traitor, and the time would surely come when she would regret having helped him. But at that moment, the girl was trying to save him and didn't want him to die in her arms. The man in the spring began to remember how he had to return home. But at that moment, he was attacked by a comrade in arms who believed that it was not necessary to leave the enemies alive. After such a dream, he suddenly woke up and tried to get up, but the deep wound did not allow him to do so. Suddenly, he noticed that there was a beautiful girl in front of him, and it turned out that she was definitely not his nanny. Now he knew for sure that it was that sweet creature who had been taking care of him all along. As soon as she woke up, she immediately offered him some food. Loretta didn't really know if the stranger would be able to swallow such solid food. But since he was very hungry, there was no other way out, and he had to eat what was given. They decided to try the dish she had prepared, but she asked him not to address her as Miss. And she decided to announce that not long ago she had to get married. In fact, the man was a little surprised when he heard this and suddenly started coughing. Now he decided that he was just wasting time with a stranger, and therefore decided to leave that house. But she couldn't leave it like that, because she saw that he had a pretty big wound on his stomach. She understood that he would be in a lot of pain and therefore insisted that he not hold back his scream. Many weeks had passed since he was wounded, but his body was in normal condition. She managed to cope quite quickly and therefore needed to be patient a little longer. He understood that it was thanks to her that he remained alive and was very grateful for it. The young man felt much better, because the girl got rid of the object in the wound that could have caused decay. He decided it was time to explain everything to her, and even dared to kick her out. But she immediately declared that she was the mistress of that house, since she had become the Duke's wife. The girl tried to explain that even though the house was very old, it still had value for her. The man immediately began to remember all the preparations for the wedding and couldn't believe what he was hearing. He always had a nanny by his side who always supported him. At that moment, he remembered that his fiancée's name was Rosa, but he did not remember her face. Now everything became clear. He was sure that he was the husband of this lovely girl. The man tried to find out if she really knew who he was. The girl understood that if he turned out to be a traitor, it would still be impossible to return the feeling they had for each other. But when he looked at her, he realized that the lady was actually very strange. He began to remember what was happening to him and was ready to take revenge. But while he was in this state, he understood that he was not yet much of an assistant. The young man was pleased to enter a house that was warm and cozy, although he had not expected it at all. The next day she felt very bad, but as soon as she looked out the window she noticed the first snow, which looked beautiful. At the same time as she was surprised, the girl was a little disappointed because now she couldn't plant the seeds, so she went to make herself some delicious tea. The aristocrats in this place drank tea in a completely different way because for them it was like ordinary water that needed to be drunk constantly. When the first part was almost over, only then did the lady realize that something was wrong, and she felt strange and could not understand what was wrong. After the morning ritual, she quickly went to the person who was feeling very bad at that moment because she had a high fever that hadn't gone down for several days. The first thing the lady decided to do was touch his forehead to understand how bad the situation was, but as it turned out, the man actually felt a little better. The girl noticed that even in difficult times for her husband, he still tried to behave well and pretend that he didn't feel any pain at all. When the lady announced that she had brought tea, the man tried to at least somehow get out of bed to drink something hot for his sore throat. The woman was convinced that a cup of warm tea would lift his spirits a little, as well as improve his health, which was in very poor condition at that moment. He was very grateful to the lady sitting next to him because when the first drop of sweet tea entered his body, he immediately felt better, and the girl was pleased. The woman knew that it was quite cold that day, but she still decided to open the window so that the man could get some fresh air that could improve his condition. The young man wasn't going to argue because he understood it perfectly well, but he immediately heard that it was snowing heavily outside. Then the girl wanted to know if her husband didn't like snow, but he denied her assumption and immediately emphasized something completely different. After a while, he began to tell his own story, namely when he and his mother moved into this house for the first time and watched the fabulous winter. Because of this situation, this place was special for him. Because the man always remembered his mother, whom he loved so much, and all the beautiful moments that were connected with her. It was because of the death of his loved one that he never appeared in this place again, and after a while the workers stopped even doing regular cleaning. At times it was hard for the man to endure all that suffering, but without it all he saw no point in continuing to live. Having composed his thoughts, The young man decided to force himself to get out of bed and say something to the worker who wanted to leave him, but it turned out to be not so easy for him. When he felt sick, the woman immediately turned her head and realized that something was wrong, and a second later ran to the guy to help him. When she noticed the man, she was truly surprised because she didn't expect to see him on his feet again. Then the little boy fell a little sick, but later started feeling better, so he immediately came to his mother. The first thing he did was hug her and emphasize that he had missed her for a very long time and wanted to see her with his own eyes as soon as possible. The workers calmly watched this from the sidelines, and it was very nice to watch, because the little boy finally saw his loved one. The girl still suspected that something was wrong with his son, but he continued to assure her that he felt fine. Turning his head the other way, he noticed a woman and began to truly think that this was his future wife who looked a lot like her. His mother paid no attention to all these actions because she thought it was her son who was still young and didn't quite understand what he was saying. The girl, in turn, continued to calmly do her work and knew that she had to clean the entire house, which was quite difficult. Without wasting time, they wanted to go eat together, and then the boy was extremely happy because he hadn't remembered such moments for a long time. At times, the woman coughed quite often, but she emphasized that this was no problem because she had had minor problems with her pancreas for a long time. It wasn't long before she decided to leave the boy sitting next to her, but her son didn't understand what was going on at all. His mother was very shocked when she saw her child in her room again and wasn't sure if he had finished eating everything. And as it turned out, the little boy just wanted to spend time with his loved one because he hadn't seen her in a very long time. He was worried about his mother, and she was the only person he had who truly supported him in difficult times, but unfortunately wasn't always there. But before they could discuss their personal belongings, the employees announced that they had brought special medicine that the lady needed for her stomach. She did not expect the workers to do their job so quickly and efficiently, and the little boy was upset again because his mother had been taken away. And the workers began to surround her with their attention, but the little boy still sat and did not want to leave his loved one. His relative was a calm and caring woman who didn't worry about anything because she understood that she needed to get some treatment to improve her health. These pleasant memories always warmed his soul in difficult moments when he was losing his last hope for a life he did not always love. Loretta was always nearby, and as soon as she noticed that her husband had woken up, she decided to go up to him and find out how he was feeling today. As soon as she noticed that he wanted to make the first move, the woman immediately objected and asked that the man not do it under any circumstances. Looking at this person, he often remembered his mother, because she was just as caring and gentle. She couldn't read his thoughts, but she understood that the man treated her very well. After several days had passed, she did not stop doing her job well and taking care of her husband, who could not yet do anything on his own. While choosing vegetables for a new soup, she remembered how her husband had felt the previous Sunday, and realized that he was slowly regaining his strength. At times, it was difficult for her to do her job, but she was convinced that she had to do it because it was her duty. Cooking didn't take her much time, and it was also her pleasure, which she was proud of since childhood. Because this winter was quite harsh, the girl couldn't always go to a village to buy groceries, and she didn't really like it. She had barely finished her household chores when she noticed a man who decided to approach her and help her a little. And at that moment, her surprise knew no bounds, but he convinced her that he now had the strength to get back on his feet. And the man also heard a wonderful aroma wafting from the kitchen. As soon as she lightly touched his body, the man winced in pain, and then she emphasized that he didn't yet have enough strength to help her. At that moment, the man heard the woman start to mock him, so he decided to immediately ask her again and see if he had heard her wrong. In response to these words, she simply smiled sweetly at him, but the man still didn't understand what it was about. The woman didn't want to offend him in any way, so she noticed it right away. She just enjoyed talking to her husband. As soon as they sat down at the table, a few seconds later, the man simply ate everything because he was too hungry, and the girl was pleased that she had prepared something delicious. In the end, the woman again wanted to know how she could help her husband, but he said that she had already done a lot for him. After dinner, he wanted to clean everything himself, but realized that he didn't have the opportunity, so the girl decided to help him and started cleaning. This made the man feel very uncomfortable, because he again realized that he had some health limitations and could not function normally. Despite the fact that he did not have enough strength in his hands, the man decided to find a way to help the girl. After some time, he called her over and emphasized that he wanted to discuss something with her, but the girl still didn't know what exactly the man wanted to tell her. At that moment, she even started to worry a little because she heard a pause that, in her opinion, could not lead to anything good. Then the young man decided to start the dialogue by saying that he wanted to tell the story of a time in his life when he was wrongfully accused of treason. In response, the girl asked if the Imperial family had done it. After such a question, the man was a little surprised because he did not expect that she knew anything about it. The hero continued to have a desire to tell her more, but decided to find out if she really trusted his words and knew what he was talking about. The girl emphasized that she would be happy to listen to her husband, and he could clearly see that she even held her breath because she was really interested in listening to it. The man was confident in his words. Then the girl asked if he had any evidence that he really wasn't involved in this case and that he was just accused. As it turned out, once upon a time, a worker betrayed his husband, and after some time he cruelly came to the husband with some requests. As it turned out, he had a very valuable necklace that was made from the dragon's own tear, and it was one of the most valuable things in this world. After this story, she was very excited, but continued to listen to her husband because it really turned out to be interesting. He also added that if a person drinks even a little of this tear, they will begin to speak the absolute truth and will not be able to lie. But the girl didn't quite understand how this was connected with her husband's betrayal, and then he started laughing because he realized that the lady was very smart. The young man added that because he wore such an expensive necklace, he was often attacked, and that's why the man moved to this place to feel safe. He was pleasantly surprised when he noticed each time how the girl listened attentively and with interest told him something in response. Having got back to his feet, the man finally said that if his life suddenly ended, this would be the girl's only chance to survive in this world with the help of this necklace. At times, she didn't really understand the young man's story, although she tried to think about his words so that she would know what to do in a difficult situation in the future. Standing up to her husband, she wanted to understand how exactly, with the help of the substance, he wanted to remove all the accusations that people had made against him. Looking in her direction, he wanted to know if the girl had received any letter saying that she had been invited to some interesting place. When he heard a negative answer, he noted that in early spring, the girl should also receive a letter inviting her to a beautiful ball. But before going to such a ball, he wanted to completely restore his body, because to get there, he needed to somehow lure the guards. Quickly turning her head in his direction, she didn't understand what was being discussed because she thought they would come there completely honestly. The man understood perfectly well that if they left together in this condition, he wouldn't last long because his legs couldn't stand properly yet. At first, he thought that the girl should have stayed home for a while because if something went wrong, she would remain safe and sound. At times, she felt bad that he hadn't invited her to this beautiful banquet himself because she knew she could have easily helped him in difficult moments. The girl didn't want to tell him the whole truth and understood that if she did, she would have to work for her husband for the rest of her life. That day, she was incredibly upset and wanted her husband to finally recover as soon as possible and be able to calmly do all the housework himself, as well as go to the ball. When the man noticed that there was no smile on her face now and she went into another room, he wanted to know if he had said anything inappropriate to her. Without wasting time, she quickly got dressed and wanted to go outside to get some fresh air and do some useful work. Feeling more strength in his legs, he continued to watch her, and then the woman wanted to know if he was going to go out with her. The woman knew that the weather was starting to get worse and understood that this was the time when she needed to get all the chores done so that she wouldn't have to come back to them later. But the man wanted to help. He emphasized that this time she could safely rely on him because now he felt much more strength in his hands and knew what he was doing. Looking into her eyes, he was sure that now he could take care of himself at least a little and was not afraid to be left alone. But before he could go outside, the woman quickly grabbed her bag and decided to do the work herself. Then the man wanted to quickly catch her. He continued to watch her closely because in a fairly short period of time, the worker had become a very important person in his life. Larita was still sure that he definitely wouldn't be able to follow her that far because of the amount of snow. But the Count followed her footsteps exactly and saw everything she did. A moment later, he was beside her, although he was afraid that she might get very angry. As soon as they had finished all the work, the girl decided that it was fashionable to go back. The Count had by then become stronger after his injury, which is why he could so easily catch the fish with his bare hands. At that moment, they were both actually having a lot of fun. While they were arguing about who would carry the container filled with water, the woman couldn't hold back and poured it all over him. Now the man was all wet, and the water on him had turned to ice from the severe frost. As soon as they were home, Loretta began to warm the Count by the fire, and they started laughing again when they remembered the fish he had managed to catch. The man immediately decided that now he could put all his affairs aside and calmly fry the fish. Since they started living together, they haven't called each other by their first names yet. For a moment, he didn't understand what was happening to her. The girl understood that the man did not know that she was actually not Rosa, but Loretta, but she could not admit it. She didn't want to explain anything at all, so she ordered him not to approach her. Later, she pulled herself together and wanted to set the table for dinner. No matter how hard he tried to establish a relationship with her, nothing worked. Loretta didn't know how the situation would resolve itself, but for now she needed to gather her thoughts. The young man decided to give her time to calm down, but then he still wanted to continue his conversation. He was very interested in knowing why the girl was behaving like that. She was crying quietly and didn't know what to do next. All the time she had to remember the face of her sister who never gave Loretta peace. Even in childhood, the two of them could not find a common language, and therefore were on different levels. The girl always remembered all the insults, as well as the looks of everyone around her when she was accused of something. Meanwhile, she decided she needed to pull herself together. There was a lot of work to do at home, so she decided she needed to put the past aside a bit and start working. And she also decided that the Count should be allowed to call himself Rosa. As soon as he saw her, he decided to approach her and touch her. But at that moment, they heard some strange footsteps behind the door. They were both very embarrassed, but the girl decided that they had come to deliver the invitations for them. But no one needed to know that the Count was alive, so he had to hide. It turned out that the man was from the administration, so the door had to be opened. Loretta heard that they were from the Imperial court for the census. She said that she lived there all alone, but from the footprints to the house it was clear that there were two of them there. So the soldier decided to go in and make sure, but the girl didn't want to let him in. She had to lie that a herbalist had recently visited her, so there were a lot of traces. He didn't feel like going at all because the road to the house was far, and he decided to drink tea. The girl was very scared that no one would find her guest, so she quickly headed to the kitchen to check. The young man tried so hard to hide, but because of his wound, which had not yet healed, he was a little clumsy. She tried to figure out that it was the cats that were a bit raging in the kitchen, which is why the soldier heard the strange sounds. Loretta asked the soldier to go outside with her and help her drive them away. It seemed to the man that the lady was a little out of her mind since she had a knife in her hands, so he did not argue with her. He decided that he needed to quickly escape from that very strange place. Now we could close the door tightly and calm down a bit. Loretta still couldn't come to her senses. She was very scared for the Count, so she needed to calm down. In fact, the young man was pleased that the girl protected him and did not betray him to the military. Later, she decided that he could call her Rosa, but she hid her real name for now. I had to report that she didn't really like her name. Loretta also understood that not every aristocrat would want to marry her, since she was illegitimately born. It seemed to her that if everything ended well, then the real Rosa, namely Loretta's sister, would one day be by the Count's side. And she will remain forever alone in that large estate. He still couldn't take his eyes off her and didn't dare call her by name. So I decided not to waste time and start cooking the fish I caught myself. He had to remember how they all took turns cooking on the ship in their crew. A lot of time had passed since that moment, but the Count understood that the cooking skills had not been forgotten. The girl began to like the smell more and more, so she decided that she could also cook vegetables with the fish. He couldn't wait for her to taste his dish and, of course, appreciate it. Loretta actually liked everything very much, and besides, she couldn't remember when she had eaten something so soft. The Count was with her the whole time and never left her side for a minute. He really enjoyed watching her. And the heroine, looking at him, understood that at that moment he was her family. Very soon the winter was over. Everything around began to bloom. While he was sitting on the porch feeding the cats, the landlady had already woken up. Over time, they have already gotten used to each other. The Count even began to show signs of attention and give flowers, which greatly surprised Loretta. Suddenly, their pleasant conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. The man gave an invitation to the Imperial palace and asked for a seal of approval for safe delivery. As soon as the delivery man left the house, the Duke couldn't wait to read the invitation. The Duke immediately remembered his past life, the servants and the multitude of assistants who had always surrounded him. At that moment, he even felt ashamed of what he had done when he left his family. As soon as the man looked at his wife, he realized that all the time he was with her, he could only rely on her. She understood that it was really difficult for him and decided to hug and support him. It seemed to her that she had definitely decided on her feelings for him, and therefore suggested going to the ball together. It was all so strange for him to hear that he didn't even know what to say to her. The man was very angry and emphasized that he had already told the woman why she should not do what the lady had just done in front of him. Taking her by the shoulders, the young man said that now the lady had to stay at home and could not go with him because it was dangerous for her life, but the girl did not want to obey him. Then the beauty thought that she wasn't doing it for her husband and that she had her own needs that she also wanted to satisfy at least in some way. The beauty clearly stated that the duchy he so desperately wanted to regain belonged to her as well. Therefore, she was determined to go with him. Having fully listened to his significant other, he was now convinced that he could not stand in her way because she would still do her own thing. The girl had dreamed all her life of wearing a luxurious dress and going out to socialize with people who were in the elite. Therefore, she did not want to give it up. Now the man was convinced that he could not influence her decision in any way, so he decided that he would support her to the end, no matter what happened. He also remembered the moment when the girl always listened to him and supported him in any endeavors. Therefore, he decided that he would do the same towards her. The young man knew that the girl had always wanted a luxurious life, and then he was sure that as soon as he regained everything he had lost, he would immediately do everything for her. The lady was sure that if the man went alone, he would not succeed, because there were many scoundrels there who could simply confuse him. He was convinced that he would stand by his loved one until the end, even if it meant giving his life for it. Loretta was simply shocked after hearing what she heard, and realized that this man was truly a very close person, despite all their previous conflicts. After some time, the girl wanted to clean the house and opened one room, but a lot of different objects fell out on her and the man got a little scared. The young man quickly wanted to run to her and help, but she didn't want his help, and then the man suggested going to the ball with her. After hearing this, Loretta was very surprised but immediately accepted the offer, and now the young people needed to find a beautiful dress for her. As it turned out, he had known this house for much longer than a month, and found another floor that the girl had never known about, even though she had lived here for a long time. After climbing the mountain, he took a small white suitcase in which there was supposed to be at least some kind of dress for the girl, and then she was very pleased. He said that this box was supposed to contain her mother's clothes. After these words, she wanted to open it as soon as possible to see what was inside. Noticing the amazing white dress, she was simply stunned by how beautiful the girl was, because she had never had her own dress before. The young man was a little worried that such a dress might no longer be in fashion and had been sewn many years ago. But the lady never intended to replace this dress with anything, and noticed how beautiful this outfit was that was sewn for his mother. Many weeks had passed since that moment, and only a few days remained for preparation before the long-awaited ball. Now the man felt much more confident, because he had fully recovered and had the strength to help his loved one in all matters. The couple always praised each other because everyone knew that they tried very hard to look as good as possible at this ball and no worse than the others. As it turned out, they arrived at this place very timely, and then the man invited the girl to get into the carriage and go with him to this long-awaited event. But before they could discuss anything, they heard people start shouting very loudly, but no one understood what such a reaction was about. Everyone was delighted to see Loretta, and then the man realized that she was quite a popular person, but the girl was very afraid of such unnecessary attention. At times it seemed to her that she would be alone until her death, but her husband managed to quickly calm her down and emphasize that everything was fine and she had nothing to worry about. Holding out his hand to her, he suggested that they go together to a prominent place and do some important things that could affect their lives. After such words, she could not refuse her husband, and then they got into the carriage, and the young man asked if the girl remembered their main plan, which the young people would soon have to implement. The first thing he decided to do was tell them where their starting point was, and where they were going to go in the future, but the girl wasn't scared at all because she was ready for anything. The exhausted beauty finally arrived at her destination, but now she had no strength to do anything because the road turned out to be too difficult. Arriving at a new place, they quickly got out of the carriage and noticed a magnificent city that shone with beautiful lights that shone right in their faces every time. As soon as they entered the hotel, the administrator greeted them and announced the prices for a large and small room. Hearing such a high price, they were truly surprised because they didn't expect this place to be so expensive, and the man also noted that it was twice as expensive as a regular hotel. No one was going to change their prices, so he calmly took the money out of his pocket and the girl continued to watch. Without thinking twice, they chose a small room and they didn't have much money in their pockets. So they didn't have to think long, but the man was a little surprised. At times she felt a little sad because no one expected such a trip and didn't know it would be so expensive, but the woman took it all in stride. When they arrived at the room, they were stunned. At first, they listened to the woman's story, saying that the room was really small, but when they found it, it wasn't so bad. The first thing Loretta wanted to do was see the area and what was there, but her husband went to bring in at least some things so they could slowly settle in. When they started unpacking, the woman asked if the man wanted to go wash up after the trip, but he wasn't expecting such a question. Coming out of the shower, he now felt good because there was no trace of sweat on his body, and a second later, he noticed the woman who was already completely asleep. The young man admired her sweetly for quite a long time, and was pleased that his significant other behaved so politely. Sitting on the bed, he knew that she needed rest much more than anything else, and she was indeed very tired after the hard journey. After that, my partner also wanted to rest, so he decided to very carefully lie down next to the girl and rest a little. Each time he pressed himself closer to her, and also did not forget to look into her eyes, which seemed to him the most beautiful in the whole world. It didn't take long before they both fell asleep in each other's arms, because each of them knew that the next day would be the easiest, so they wanted to get a good rest. The next day, they tried to get ready as quickly as possible for an event they had been waiting for several months to properly prepare for. She immediately noticed that she didn't know if she was wearing the dress her husband had given her correctly, but she knew that she had tried very hard to listen to his advice and dress correctly. Looking at Loretta, he was speechless and simply could not say anything because he saw a beautiful woman who reminded him very much of his mother. At times she felt uncomfortable because she knew that these were not her clothes and tried to be as careful as possible with them. Looking at the woman, the man said that the lady looked simply beautiful, and then she was incredibly happy to hear such words because she had tried her best. She never forgot for a moment that her husband also needed to do something, but after these words, he didn't quite understand what the girl was telling him. After listening to all her words, the young man said that he would do everything in his power, and it was incredibly pleasant for Loretta to hear. As soon as they arrived at their destination in the carriage, the man was the first to get out and offer his hand to his partner, who had been preparing for this for a long time. When the worker met them, he immediately asked the young couple to show him their letters inviting them to this event, because without them, it was impossible to miss anyone. After reading the letter about the young couple, the man was truly surprised, because he understood that these were unusual people and should be treated differently. And it seemed to the woman that they had made it to this ball without any difficulties, and she really liked it, but now she wanted to concentrate on her preparations. But at that moment, the worker noticed that he wanted to see the man's face, and without that, he couldn't miss it, but he had to see the real face. The woman politely asked the worker not to do this. As it turned out, the man's face was not pretty enough. He had received a severe burn as a child, and the worker saw it with his own eyes. He didn't behave very politely and insulted the man. The girl immediately didn't like it and started yelling at him loudly. The worker really felt a little uneasy. For the first time in his life, he saw a man whose skin was severely damaged over a large percentage of his body. After this short dialogue, the girl finally wanted to know if they could finally enter the palace and start the ball with everyone. Now he had no right to miss them, so he politely invited them to a banquet where most of the people in the congregation were already there. Then they noticed many beautiful women in front of them who had quite expensive outfits, but this still did not affect the girl's decision to go to this event. The first thing they had to do was enter the door where two workers were standing, but now there were no questions for them about their invitation. The man tried to be very careful and look around, understanding that the threat could be very unexpected. He tried to cover his face as often as possible, but he knew that in a few days he would come to people with a very confident self-esteem. The man left, then at the end he asked the girl to feel confident, but as soon as the man was not around, she started to behave very strangely. It didn't take long for her to notice a person who was very unpleasant and immediately started yelling at her. At first, the confident person wondered if Loretta, whom she had known for a long time but had not seen with her own eyes so often, was really standing in front of her. Turning her head, she noticed Rosa quickly heading towards her, and then the lady didn't know how to conduct herself in such a situation. The woman was really surprised at first, because she knew that Loretta had not lived very long and thought that they had run out of food a long time ago. But everything turned out to be a little different. All these unpleasant words played a very important role for Loretta, but she tried to keep herself in check so as not to say anything unnecessary to her abuser. There were too many people looking at them, and then the woman slowed down a bit and didn't want to talk to the lady about anything because she could be kicked out of this celebration. She was really quite surprised because they had lived together for quite some time but had never spoken like that evening. When the girl noticed that the newcomer began to speak very confidently, Rosa no longer had such a great desire to humiliate her because it didn't work for anything. But in the moment she decided to come closer and emphasized that Loretta had to treat the aristocrats who played a more important role in this area differently. Pushing her on the shoulder, she decided to move away from such a girl, and after that the newcomer began to feel very bad but did not show it. With her head held high, she took a glass of champagne and went to celebrate the banquet, knowing that she had humiliated an ordinary girl. Some time had passed, but the girl still hadn't seen her partner with whom she had come to this ball, and now she was starting to worry a little about where he was. After that, the lady wanted to go out into the corridor to see how things were going in the other room, but she also understood that she had to stick to the plan. Noticing the many people in front of her, she began to feel uncomfortable, but she had to leave quickly so as not to waste her time. When Loretta started to run late, she picked up her pace and was out on the street a few minutes later. Unfortunately, she didn't notice anyone there either, and that made her very sad. The girl was sure that her husband must be somewhere nearby. Therefore, her gloomy face quickly disappeared because she understood that she had followed the plan and everything should go well. But she didn't have time to turn her head when she noticed two men who put a bag over her head and started holding it tightly. The girl who was still holding the champagne was incredibly happy that her plan had come true, and now the unpleasant stranger would never see anyone again. She left the balcony as if nothing had happened and continued to have fun with the aristocrats who were around her. Loretta kept asking for help for a long time and also tried to scream as loud as possible, but unfortunately no one heard her, and then she simply fell asleep. When the thieves had done their job, they immediately informed Rosie about it, and also emphasized that it would have been difficult to stuff the girl into the bag. While drinking tea, she continued to listen to them, and it pleased her that finally her plan was beginning to come to fruition, and that there was no competitor on her path. Later, her younger sister appeared before her again. The girl wanted to know if she liked the treatment she fully deserved. The lady didn't react to all these words because she knew how bad her sister was, so she asked what time it was. The woman wasn't going to answer her question because she thought the heroine needed to spend some more time here to understand what she was wrong about. The lady wanted Loretta to enjoy her family home, which she had left last winter, and because of this it was very difficult for them to cope alone. She was also sure that because of the girl, the lady lost the opportunity to join the Imperial family, which she had dreamed of since childhood. And the woman didn't want to humiliate herself in any way, so she answered her rather rudely, and at that moment, Rosa didn't expect to hear such an answer to her question. They discussed their childhood for quite some time and why Loretta had acted the way she did. But after a while, this conversation began to bore them. The heroine really didn't understand why her sister was so cruel to her, even though she had never done anything bad to her since childhood. After that, the older sister concluded that her relatives had really grown up a lot, because they could say such words to her face and not think about the consequences. At that moment, the woman asked one of the workers to come closer and lightly hit Loretta, who was kneeling, in the face. The girl was holding back so hard that she wouldn't cry, because now her face didn't look healthy and she was feeling incredible pain that was making itself felt. Coming a little closer, the beauty wanted to clearly argue why she had done this to her sister, because she was still offended by her action. Loretta was sure that the girl felt so confident only because her father, who always disliked her and said harsh words to her, was not around. For a second, the princess wanted to hit the girl with the vase with all her strength, but in a moment she calmed down because she knew what the consequences of this action could be. Now what she wanted most was for the woman to go to their lands, which the beauty had cruelly abandoned at that moment, and not thought about the consequences that could have been for her family. A second later, a thief arrived, and then the sister said that Loretta should be put in a carriage and taken away from that place as quickly as possible. The princess tried until the last moment to somehow get out of her husband's strong hands, but unfortunately the girl did not succeed. Finally, Rose in turn wanted to hear an apology from her sister, and also smiled slyly forever because she knew what the girl was feeling. But before the thieves could take the girl to the carriage, a worker entered, and the woman became angry because she hadn't even asked if she could enter. Then she reported that the Duke, whom everyone thought was dead, suddenly appeared in the palace, and no one knew how to properly stop him. After what she heard, she simply couldn't believe that her most terrible assumption had turned out to be reality, and now she needed to come up with some kind of plan. After talking a little more with her maid, the woman still didn't know what to do, because it was the first time she had found herself in such a difficult situation. They didn't have time to finish when Rosa rushed into the corridor to see how things were going, but the worker didn't want to leave her. Fortunately, a second later she returned to give the final task to the workers who were still standing there, not knowing what to do. The leader reported that the men brutally broke her shoulder and also put her in a carriage and quickly took her away from that place. Now the girl was trembling with fear because she was very scared of what could be done to her in a few minutes, but the woman did not want to show it. The princess did not dare to entrust such a serious job to just one worker. Therefore, she wanted another of their workers to go with them. Quickly going out into the corridor, she began to look in different directions to notice at least some small hook that she could grab onto. As soon as she walked a little further, she noticed a man and a woman, but as it turned out, she had seen them somewhere before and couldn't remember the same thing. As she got closer, she realized that it was her parents, and then her husband didn't say anything good because they had just arrived at this place and hadn't seen anything. The parents wanted to wait a bit for their child to talk to her, but after that, Rosa started to get nervous because she didn't want her family to find out about this situation. Meanwhile, the man walked forward quite confidently and was not afraid of seeing many guards in front of him who were 100% sure to get caught on his way. Turning his head in the other direction, he quite deftly made his way down every corridor he saw, but he tried to avoid being caught by the guards. Having found a shorter route, he took advantage of this opportunity to quickly reach the place where all the aristocrats were resting. He hadn't even gotten a little further when he saw the guards guarding the door, and then he realized that he needed to focus all his attention on his goals. Hearing a strange sound, one of the guards told the other that he wanted to see what was happening there because it was not the first time he had heard it. Seeing a strange coin on the floor, he picked it up and told his colleagues that he didn't see anything strange there. But within a moment, more than 5 guards were simply lying on the ground and unable to offer any resistance to the man who quickly beat them. At times it was not easy for him to get through, but he knew where he was going, so he went no matter what, because he wanted to get to his goal quickly, even without looking at the guards. As he approached the main door, an ordinary worker stood in his way and forbade him from entering, but he could not stop the man. Opening the door, he saw many aristocrats who immediately began to pay attention to him and did not understand where the security guards were at that time. One of the men decided to politely ask the stranger to leave them quickly because he had no right to be here. Then he continued to calmly look at them, but he was not going to leave this area at the request of some stranger. He reiterated his request several times but saw no response. After that, the manager put down his glass of champagne and wanted to personally talk to the man who did not react to his threats at all. As he approached, many guards appeared in front of him and asked him to surrender, as they could regard any movement as an attack on them. The woman who was next to the prince asked if everything was okay with him because she saw that there was no smile on his face at all. Turning to the knights, the young man asked them to step aside a little, while the woman calmly watched this and did not know how it would end. One of the fearless knights decided to draw his sword and start threatening the man who did not respond to any words. He made it clear that if the stranger didn't surrender now, he would need to take some action and start attacking the guy. Then he had no intention of reacting to these words, and a second later the confident man was gone. After the blow, he staggered a little, but quickly found his balance and began to attack the thief who only wanted to attack him with a sword. When the sharp blade was near his face, he began to panic but decided to stand still because he was afraid that in a second, his opponent would simply pierce him with this weapon. He stared into his eyes for a long time, waiting for the man to give up and stop resisting him, and it wasn't long before that happened. Then he got down on his knees and began to apologize, but the young man wanted to know why the scoundrel had done this, and what exactly he had planned. Looking into his eyes, he said that he wanted to make more money, as well as become famous among the aristocrats who played an important role for him. Grabbing him by the clothes, he said that this scoundrel had caused his duchy to simply fall apart, and because of this, he really wanted revenge. After that, the young man decided to let the man go and move on, thinking that he was lucky today and had a second chance to make amends. After that, he was no longer afraid to hide his face, so he quickly took off the mask that hid his face. Now he was much more confident in his victory. Coming a little closer, he introduced himself and gave his name, wanting to be respected among such respectable people. In fact, when the Duke came out, everyone was very surprised that he was alive. Once, the Empress was 100% sure that he was dead when she examined his body. It was also unclear why he decided to so boldly appear at the Imperial Palace. They tried to expel him from the Imperial Palace as they considered him a traitor, but the Duke believed that all the accusations against him were false. Everyone present didn't really want to believe the Duke's words, because in reality they only needed evidence. At that moment, he took out an object that could solve his problem. This was one of the duchy's family values, the last tier of the dragon, which forced to answer all questions only with the truth. Therefore, he was prepared to be questioned. But if it turns out that he is not a traitor, then everyone should announce that it was simply a mistake towards him. Everyone began to quietly talk and discuss the Count, but most of them did not understand what was happening. The woman was determined that the entire country should belong only to her and her son. The Empress was actually very upset, but she still wanted to deal with the Duke. The young man knew well that dragon blood flowed in their family, and that is why they had the ability to verify the authenticity of products. Therefore, Her Majesty the Empress decided to check the product herself. The Empress's son decided to interrogate the Duke himself to determine whether he had in fact been unjustly convicted. But the Empress was not at all delighted that her son had confirmed the authenticity of the stones. But the young man was ready to return the Duke's clean name in exchange for keeping the palace's dirty affairs a secret. It's just that no one could even imagine that the Duke would be alive, and that now problems would arise in the palace because of this. She knew that if it weren't for the dragon's tear, no one would have believed the Duke. This woman was supposed to be the most important person in the empire, so all her questions had to be answered honestly. The son tried to convince his mother that he was right, and this time she believed him. Despite the fact that it was a dark night outside, the news of the living Duke began to spread with great speed. At that moment, he was calm that he had managed to deal with the accusations of treason. But the young men still needed to find out one more truth, besides the one that was already known. Their conversation was suddenly interrupted by the entire crew, who were very happy to see their captain alive. All the knights of the Duke's family suddenly knelt before the Duke. Even the Countess appeared before the Duke. She believed with all her heart that he was alive. The young man was a little surprised when he saw that everyone around him started to shed tears, but considering what they had been through, it was acceptable. They were ready to hear the Count's story, but he was ready to tell it. The Duke refused to ride alone in the carriage and decided to first pick up the person who was waiting for him. At that very moment, a girl from the county noticed that a kidnapping was taking place. But everyone decided to ignore it, except for the girl, who couldn't take her eyes off it. Still, she could not resist and informed the Duke that his wife had gone to her residence in the capital. He was a little disappointed because he had ordered her to hide and wait for him. The Duke decided not to waste time and tell his wife the good news that now he could no longer hide. Everyone in the other estates was also stunned that the Duke was heading specifically to them. The man even thought that now the Duke would start taking revenge on everyone and looking for his real wife, not the one who was sent to him. Very soon the man found himself in a palace where he was not really wanted to be seen. But we had to pretend that the news of his good deeds pleased everyone, and now we could discuss many different issues. The man who hosted the Duke knew that the guest was very busy with family matters. But the Duke was actually not pleased to listen to him, as he understood that it was they who had left his wife alone in the estate. The husband and wife decided to emphasize that the Duke's wife was still with them. Rose's mother was very happy that her daughter's husband came to pick her up in person. So she decided to quickly take him to Rose's room, but she didn't yet know how it would end. In fact, the man simply couldn't find a place for himself. He couldn't even sit down. Meanwhile, the girl wanted to ask her husband a little about how he had lived before all these events. But since she was in no hurry, she was ready to listen to his whole story from beginning to end. Now she knew that it was all thanks to Rosa that the Duke was able to get back on his feet. The Count explained that it was Rosa's father who sent her to the estate because of a wedding that didn't take place and left her alone. But a lot of things didn't fit in the man's head, so he decided to figure it all out. The assistant also thought that there was something completely wrong here. As soon as the girl entered the room, the Count immediately realized that it was definitely not his wife in front of him. But she immediately introduced herself, that her name was Rosa, and that it was she who, by law, should become his wife. The girl suggested going into the room and having tea together. The Duke was not at all in the mood for tea and announced that it was definitely a misunderstanding. He believed that in the place of this girl there should be another one with silver hair and blue eyes. Rosa couldn't believe that the Duke kept asking about Loretta, and the assistant immediately reported that it was thanks to Loretta that her captain was able to get back on his feet. Rosa could not believe that her sister had managed to meet the Duke after all, and could not help but call her illegitimate. For the Duke, it was all very strange, and he did not understand what he should do next. He immediately pictured her face and thought that she must have been acting quite strange all along. Now it became clear to him that Larita behaved this way because she didn't want him to find out that she was illegitimate. One could only imagine how the poor girl lived in her family, because even the closest people treated her like a nobody. The man understood that it was all really terrible. And Rosa decided that his mood had simply worsened because they, along with their entire family, had replaced his bride. But the assistant understood that the captain would need a legal wife who could continue his lineage. Rosa was simply stunned by the events. She had not expected everything to turn out this way. But at that moment, they just froze in place. The Duke simply became uncontrollable. Loretta received from such an impudent sister. Rosa still couldn't resist and believed that he still wanted to meet with Loretta. He was screaming all the time and couldn't calm down because he wanted to find his beloved. And it was unclear to Rosa why he was trying so hard to find her sister. He opened the door with all his might and set off to run around the estate in search of Loretta. There were a lot of thoughts and questions in his head that he didn't have answers to yet. Rosa also could not leave him alone and began to run after him with all her might. But suddenly he stopped when he heard from Rosa that the girl wasn't actually there. She had to tell him that her father and mother had sent Loretta to their land because she had already crossed the border. He began to shake it with all his might to hear when exactly it happened and how far away their lands were. Rosa added that they had not left so long ago, so they could not have left the borders of their capital yet. But the girl still wanted to know from him why he decided to act in this way and look for her sister. After all, it was Rosa who was his legal wife and wanted to be with him. The Duke proudly announced that he considered Loretta to be his true wife, so he turned around and rushed to find her. The mother could not understand what had happened to her daughter and what could have happened there. The woman tried to calm the girl down a bit and find out why the Count had started behaving like this. In fact, everyone was shocked when they learned that the man had come specifically to find the illegitimate girl. Rosa was simply mad and started destroying everything around her because she didn't understand why he had done this to her. The father was disappointed with his daughter's behavior because she couldn't even hold on to her chance, which came straight to her. The assistant now wanted to know if her captain was really ready to take another lady as his wife. He didn't really understand what the problem was because it was Loretta who saved his life and was by his side the whole time. But the assistant believed that there might be bad rumors about them, especially in the future if she gave birth to a child. The Duke was not at all ready to listen to all this chatter. He even decided that his assistant could find herself another captain. He took one horse and no longer wanted to even turn around when the girl shouted in his direction. But she quickly decided to accept his decision, take the carriage, and follow him. In fact, he was pleased with her decision, so he suggested they rest a bit before the long journey that awaited them. Everyone in the city was shouting about the news that the Duke, who was thought to be dead, turned out to be alive. The girl, meanwhile, was in the carriage with a bunch of bruises on her body, and she was being transported precisely on the Count's land. As soon as she read the news about the Duke, she immediately felt calmer in her heart that he had managed to dispel the false rumors about him. The girl was in serious condition, and on the bad road she realized that they had now left the capital. Her arm was broken and she lost the ability to feel, and she also constantly wanted to close her eyes. Suddenly the carriage door opened and she saw exactly what she had not expected to see. Before her was the man of her dreams, whom she fell in love with, even though she hadn't expected it to happen. Opening her eyes, the girl saw a man standing opposite her and looking at her fantastic appearance. He began to explain why he had come here, and also called the woman by her name for the first time, which surprised her quite a bit. The girl looked at him for a long time and could not hold back her tears because the right side of her arm hurt very much and she could not make a normal movement. Her breathing began to accelerate very quickly, and this frightened her husband, and then Loretta lowered her eyes and could not do anything. The woman said that she felt uncomfortable when the man shouted at her, but clearly noted that she did not belong to him, so she could do whatever she wanted. A second later, the young man began to apologize and emphasized that he didn't want to offend her. That's why he simply didn't think before saying something. He stared into her eyes for a long time and couldn't believe how such a beautiful woman could accuse him of such an act. After that, he grabbed her face and gently said that he didn't mean to yell at her because she simply didn't understand him. He announced that he would never do bad things again, nor would he give up on such a beautiful woman as Loretta. The man was convinced that if he had not met such a beautiful person in front of him, he would not have been able to exist normally in this world. He began to remember the situation when the woman took him by the shoulders and pulled him to the fireplace and began to heal him. He also remembered the times when she cooked for him and cared for him even when it was very difficult. The woman listened to this story with great pleasure. Therefore, she could not take her eyes off her interlocutor. After all this, the man clearly noticed that he now had enough reasons to consider this person very close to him. When I touched her shoulder, she started crying very hard because it turned out she had a dislocation that prevented her from doing anything. Having forcefully risen to her knees, she did not know how to move further because her hand simply did not allow her to do so. When he saw that the woman's eyes were beginning to close, he began to push her and ask her to control herself. After that, he wanted to help Loretta, so he asked her to give him her hand because of the pain, and he tried to do something. She didn't want to do this because with every movement the pain became stronger and she didn't like it very much. She began to worry that after a while her hand would swell and she would simply not be able to move it in any way in the future, and these thoughts would not leave her head. Bowing her head to him, she said that she was very much counting on her husband's support. After a while she started crying again, but through her tears she said that she was completely ready to heal her hand. Pressing her closer to him, the young man said that she needed to be patient a little because it would be a difficult procedure. A second later, there was a very loud crunch, and then he pressed the woman against him and wanted to know if everything was okay. Having laid the lady on the floor, he sincerely wanted Loretta to rest a little after these procedures, which were quite exhausting for her body. After that, he wanted to hear from the woman, but she didn't say anything, and as it turned out, the lady was coughing a little because of what had just happened. Looking at her, he felt very sorry for the woman because of everything she had been through so much, but he was convinced that she would get better. After a while, taking her in his arms, he wanted to take the lady to his carriage to go to another place. The woman was surprised when she noticed that the man still managed to bring the lady who was in such a difficult situation. Then she clearly emphasized that she would be able to lead the hostess only if the husband himself entrusted her with such an important matter. Moving a little closer to the door, he gently laid the woman down where she could get some sleep. After everyone had boarded the carriage, it began to move after a while. Meanwhile, the woman was looking clearly at the man and the lady. She looked at them for quite a long time, and also noticed that the Duke was starting to treat her very well, and she didn't like it a bit. When some time had passed, she decided to ask her husband directly if he had any feelings for Loretta. Then he clearly stated that he was simply performing his duties as a normal man. She still had a different opinion, although the captain answered her question rather rudely, and he didn't hear anything more from her side. After he responded rudely, they drove in silence and never talked about anything else together. Loretta, in turn, simply slept peacefully and didn't hear anything because she was very tired after such an exhausting day. After that, she simply looked calmly out the window and at times envied the woman who was constantly receiving attention from men. The next day they finally arrived at the Duke's house, and then the gate in front of them was locked, and no one would open it. As soon as he got closer to the gate, he noticed that he had only been gone for 6 months, and the gate was already starting to rust. When they finally managed to get inside, he was very surprised because it was his favorite place. He often recalled all the events that had happened in his life right here, and it was very pleasant for him, but at the same time sad. Then the woman said that she had sent a maid who had to clean everything perfectly so that there was nothing superfluous. As soon as they climbed a little higher, they immediately noticed real hired workers who were doing their job with all their might. One of them was very surprised to see the Count here, as well as the woman he was holding. Everyone who worked for the Count quickly began to converge on him, because they did not expect to see their boss today, whom they had not seen for so long. Then some of them were very careless and simply slipped on the spot, and it was unpleasant for the man. They wanted to help each other, but they just fell off their feet and wanted to go to their wife, whom they hadn't seen for so long. The young man did not expect such a reaction, therefore he did not want to deviate from his plan, so he decided to take the girl to a safe place. Not paying attention to people, he continued on his way no matter what, because he still had a girl in his arms. The nanny was the first to decide to approach him and chat, because she hadn't seen the man in a long time and had forgotten what he looked like. At that moment, he had no desire to communicate with this person, but then she began to impose herself on him and wanted to achieve her own goals. Everyone else was just sitting on their knees and looking at each other, and at that moment they started looking only in the direction of the Count. Each of them wanted to tell their own story, but it was very difficult for the man, and he did not want to listen to these strange stories. They still tried to treat their husband well, because they knew he was an important person in their home. One of them began to tell me that even in difficult times, they exchanged letters with each other to always remember everyone. The first thing they wanted to know was why the woman was in the Count's arms, and some of them thought it was his wife. One of them was very scared and began to miss the fact that the woman was seriously ill, so she wanted to help her somehow. The girl slept for quite a long time and didn't wake up at all, because this day had been quite difficult for her. The whole time the man did not leave and looked at her body clearly to see at least some movement in such a long time. After some time, he noticed the worker and reported that the girl had not woken up for the second day, but she did not see anything wrong with it. After these words, the young man decided to listen to her advice after all, because he understood that he was very nervous. She didn't stop talking to him, but after saying these words, he still asked the woman not to reassure him anymore. Then the nanny made it clear that she would look after Loretta as if she were her own daughter, so he didn't need to worry. After some time, he decided to deal with documents, namely the papers that played an important role in his life. Then his personal assistant reported that he had put all the documents in order, which was very pleasing to hear for the Duke, who had wanted to see it for a long time. After a while, a guy approached him again and wanted to talk to him, but then, for some reason, the young man was a little out of humor. He stared out the window for a long time, imagining his future life and not knowing what to do next and what to do with the girl. Meanwhile, everyone who worked for the Duke decided to personally discuss one issue that was troubling the entire team. Some of them said very bad things behind their backs that they could never say to their faces, and many people didn't like it. The man decided not to sit still and go somewhere else, because he understood that sitting around would never lead to anything good. As soon as he got closer to his workers, he noticed that they had fallen to their knees and began to apologize to their husband. Then he clearly emphasized that he had no intention of killing anyone and was a rather merciful person. After these words, people were very surprised. They turned to each other and wondered what it could mean, but no one gave a clear answer. When his partner approached him, he wanted to know his opinion, that he had thought about all this, but the man didn't know if it was necessary to give people a second chance. He was also always ready to fulfill any question of his husband, and it was nice to hear this from a hero who never doubted his partner. After a while, he got the idea of challenging someone to the ring and fighting to prove that he was truly a worthy warrior. Many of the people who worked for him believed that the man had never been a skilled warrior, and some of them said so to his face. And as it turned out, from the very beginning, the young man was not going to fight, but wanted his warrior, who was an experienced participant in such tournaments, to perform in the ring. The first to challenge the fight was a stranger who decided to tell his opponent a little about himself. When he introduced himself a little, he was surprised by the abilities his new opponent already possessed at that time. When they fought, many people watched them and concluded that the man with blonde hair was not an opponent at all. The man who still managed to get back on his feet didn't like the atmosphere and the laughter and the people standing behind him cheering for another player. After some time, he finally got to his feet and was now ready to fight again despite his deep knife wounds. He thought about this fight for a long time in his head because he didn't like how much an ordinary man who had come to show his strength was humiliated. Now the young man began to consider the partner he had respected all his life not as good as he had initially thought, because he saw in him not such a good person as at the beginning of their meeting. Other fans sitting in the stands were surprised at how determined the warrior was, who was not afraid of anything at all. They also discussed the incident when they first saw this young man, who immediately began to brag about his weapons to them. They realized that he had not made a very good reputation for himself at the beginning of their meeting, and now few people respected him among the fighters. Remembering that brutal battle, the man was completely exhausted because his body was covered in blood, which poured out more and more each time. The young fighter wanted his opponent to get back on his feet as soon as possible and continue to fight him no matter what. His arm hurt incredibly badly, and because of that, he couldn't make any movement with his body, which was in so much pain. Unfortunately, the man didn't want such a brutal fight to continue, so he decided to go over and help the two boys. Now he was convinced that they did not have enough strength to take their chance and show themselves on the big stage. They decided to put the warriors who lost in the carriage and take them to a special place, exactly where the man had pointed out. After this whole cruel spectacle was over, he announced that all the warriors who worked for him had begun training for the next fight. A second later, on his way, the man saw a woman who quickly ran up to him and wanted to tell him something. She grabbed him by the shoulders with all her might and started shaking him, and informed him that Loretta was in critical condition. And then she emphasized that the woman the nanny had always looked after had simply disappeared, and now the heroine didn't know what to do in such an unusual situation. A few hours ago, the heroine continued to rest peacefully, and her sleep was quite prolonged. After a while, she finally raised her head and began to turn in different directions to understand what environment she was in. This place seemed very amazing to her because the bed was soft, and because of that she didn't want to get up from it at all, just sleep. Her first attempt to get out of bed was unsuccessful. As soon as she wanted to get up, she couldn't either because the bedspread was heavy. After a while, a worker came in who wanted to change the bed, but when she went a little further, she didn't notice the heroine at all, who was just there. The first thing she did was go to her manager and immediately started telling him the whole story, and the man wanted to know if it was a kidnapping. After he had no idea at all, he began to wonder what could have happened to Loretta. As soon as they got a little closer, the man simply lowered his head and began to blame only himself for such a bad deed. Then the worker reported that if the woman had really fallen, she would have heard it immediately, but the manager did not want to blame her for anything. The woman was sure that the young man would not wake the lady at such a difficult moment for her. But as it turned out, he was just calmly watching her. Placing her in his strong arms, he wanted to take the girl to a quiet place so that she wouldn't hear the noise that was happening in that room. Turning his head, he noticed the nanny again and could not understand why she was still standing in one place and did not want to leave this room. Opening her eyes, one of the workers began to wave at her, also wanting the woman to pay at least some attention to her. Then she was sincerely glad to see Loretta with her own eyes, and also wanted to ask how she felt at that moment. The first thing the girl noticed was that her hand had stopped hurting at all, and it was quite a surprise for her. When she noticed that the lady really felt better, she wanted the man to finally let the girl go, but he refused to do so. A second later, she took her in her arms and wanted them to take a walk together, and also leave the Duke alone with his thoughts. The woman calmly said that she wanted to go wash up with the girl because she knew that the lady had just been sleeping and doing nothing for several days. The heroine herself was not against such an idea, because she understood that she needed to at least somehow take care of herself. She really enjoyed taking a bath, but all she could think about was the situation that had recently happened to her, as well as the man who had helped her. After some time, when she finally got tired of sitting in one place, she hired a worker. The first thing Loretta wanted to know was who was standing in front of her, because she had never seen such people in this castle before. With a big smile on her face, the woman announced that she was now the head cleaner of this large castle. She listened to these stories with great pleasure and wanted to hear the answers to her questions, but the woman took forever to answer them. Later, I realized that I needed to gather my thoughts on Loretta and also help her wash up to surprise her husband. She barely had time to turn her head when the lady began to wash the entire bathroom, and then the worker noticed that this was not her duty at all. The girl turned her head and was a little offended by her, because she could no longer just sit still and listen to her stories. When the worker was free, she immediately approached the woman and began to rub her with a special brush that was supposed to help wash the dirt off her body. Meanwhile, the man continued to sit on the stool and give various tasks to his subordinates, but he noticed that Loretta was heading to the side. As soon as he saw her, he immediately got up and suggested they go outside, because they had been indoors for many days in a row. As they began to walk down the corridor, the man immediately asked if the girl liked the duchy he owned. Then she thought about the answer and didn't notice how she just stood in one place. Because of this, the man asked her to come to him. At that moment, the woman clearly stated that she wasn't sure she liked being in this place. After these words, he made the admission that someone had scared the girl, and the first thing the man wanted to know was who it was. After that, she calmly emphasized that it was something completely different. As it turned out, it seemed to the girl that it was just some other reality. She really liked that they really treated her like a human being, and later her husband thought about them for quite a while and wanted to know why she thought that way. He asked her to always follow him, and after a few steps they climbed to a rather beautiful point on this castle. It seemed to the girl that it was dangerous here, and then he took her in his arms and placed her on a stone fence. They sat there for a long time, and the girl noticed a truly beautiful view that she really liked. Looking at a woman, he was always simply amazed at how beautiful she was, but at that moment something began to hurt him. At that time, he didn't want to attach any significance to it, so he immediately gave his jacket to the girl so that she wouldn't freeze. A second later, the man noticed how Loretta began to approach him, and he began to feel uncomfortable. A few minutes later, the girl was right under his nose, and he also had the impression that she had lost her beautiful appearance over the past few days. She couldn't figure out what the problem was, so she decided it had to do with her face. She thought she was pretty at first, but then for some reason she decided she was scary now. But the Duke thought quite differently, since he now knew very well that she had lived for a very long time and believed in such nonsense. That's why I wanted her to forget all about it and never even remember it. Suddenly, she leaned over and began to fall to the bottom. With all his strength, the man grabbed her and held her tightly. He definitely couldn't let anything happen to her. The man really hoped that everything would be fine with her, because he was next to her. Loretta tried to explain to him that she understood everything, and that in fact everyone around her was picking on her not because of her face. The girl spent her whole life blaming only herself and letting all situations pass her by, but this didn't make life any easier. She tried to say that all the people from the county didn't know where to hide their anger, so they just used it on her. After hearing all this, the man was ready to solve all her problems and always be by her side. She was very pleased that the Duke was the only one who called her by her name so affectionately. But as soon as he touched her, he immediately felt that she had a fever. She was definitely sick. The husband really wanted to cheer her up, but it was impossible, so he decided that he still needed to call a doctor. She couldn't believe that now there was just the right person who could take care of her. Since the girl had been hungry for a long time, the nanny suggested that she try the soup and do it very slowly. And only then perhaps something else from what was prepared on the table. The man believed that the nanny's care put a bit of pressure on Loretta because she was not a little girl. But the woman didn't want to hear anything at all. She was convinced that she was doing everything right. From the girl's perspective, the relationship between the Duke and the nanny was similar to that of a mother and son, and this made her heart grow warmer. Now it was clear to her that when the man was lying sick, he was clearly dreaming of this very woman who had been his nanny since childhood. To distract the girl a little, the Duke remembered the cat that had remained on the estate and suggested that she visit it. When he saw that Loretta was happy, he then added that he had already sent people to bring her to them. Meanwhile, the hero decided to ask a little later what his wife had to go through in that county. After such a lunch, she felt like she had overeaten a little, but now she had to go through so that all the servants could greet her and introduce themselves. All the servants were happy to welcome the new mistress of that great palace. Loretta had never been in such a situation, so she couldn't even imagine how it was possible to remember such a large number of people. All the smart girls were chosen for the lady, and the nanny hoped that they would all like her. Everyone was very grateful for the honor of caring for her. At first glance, they realized that their new mistress was unsurpassed. We could end there for now and move on to getting to know the knights of the palace. The knights were immediately ready to salute when their new mistress came out to them. They took up their swords and immediately bowed their heads before the girl. She was very pleased that everyone respected her so much and treated her so well. They were all eagerly awaiting the new mistress of the house and wanted to show themselves to her. As the nanny had told her, everyone around her was kind, talkative, and pleasant. But many of them were ordinary people and did not know how to behave well, as they did not know the rules of etiquette. It was very strange for her to hear that there was a place in the knightly detachment for ordinary people. But there were also many knights with good origins who went to serve other families. These two were constantly trying to convey something to the hostess, but she looked at them with wide eyes and didn't even understand what they were talking about. So the nanny decided to quickly pick her up so that Loretta could get some rest from all this. They put her to bed, blew out the candles, and wanted her to enjoy her rest. The lady understood that everyone she met that day were very nice people because she hadn't met anyone like that lately. At that moment, she felt a little sad that she and the Count were sharing different rooms, but she was actually grateful that she had been so well received. For a very long time she couldn't sleep, and remembered that her whole life she hadn't had a good family, so she wasn't even interested in having children. Loretta understood that she could not be angry with the Count if he could have a mistress, but she decided to ask him this question herself. Later, when she opened her eyes, she immediately woke up and wanted to see who had been constantly walking next to her. Then, with her own eyes, the girl noticed a worker opening the window so that at least some sun could enter Loretta's room. As soon as the woman noticed that the girl had woken up, she immediately wanted to make her a delicious breakfast in bed. But first she wanted to have at least some minimal hairdo done because her hair didn't look very good after sleeping. While the employee was doing her usual work, she heard an interesting question from the lady, namely, where was her husband, who had been gone for a long time. The worker could not provide exact information, but she was convinced that he was working at his regular job, as he always did. After a while, the girl was ready to go somewhere, and then the worker suggested that she go outside. After listening to her advice, she was surprised because all her workers always smiled sincerely, and she also noticed the beautiful sun. The gardener, as always, praised the girl and spoke pleasant words to her, and after that her mood immediately improved. She always tried to politely thank him for such nice words, but she didn't understand why everyone was so polite to her. After a long-standing, not-so-good attitude towards her, the girl was not very used to accepting such an attitude towards herself. A second later, the man noticed how the lady started to simply pick his flowers, and then he started to get a little nervous. When 3 days had passed, the man finally returned to his unusual place of residence and wanted to see the girl. Meeting her in the hallway, he wanted to know how she felt and how the workers who were supposed to do their jobs treated her. After that, he wanted to apologize for his attitude because he didn't warn the girl that he would be away from work for so long. Then she bowed politely to him and reported that she was feeling very well at that time. Loretta also realized that she didn't have to get attached to the man, so she just turned around and went the other way. He wasn't going to let her go, so he decided to follow the girl and ask what happened because he saw that she wasn't in a good mood. When she returned, the girl looked at him strangely and didn't want her husband to constantly follow her and watch what she was doing. He sincerely didn't want to believe that he had somehow offended the girl, but it seemed to him that when they lived in a different place, the girl was much happier. Turning her head, the lady noticed how the man caught a fish with his bare hands, but she did not see anything strange in this. The young man started to laugh a little because he didn't understand why she was behaving that way at that moment. Sitting down a little closer, the girl wanted to understand why he was laughing so much, because at that moment she didn't feel like doing it at all. After some time, the young man offered to have a delicious meal with a new chef who was supposed to make exquisite dishes. After that, the girl didn't answer anything, but later asked why he had behaved so strangely at first, and then he didn't know what to say. Lowering her head, she wanted to gather her thoughts to properly express her opinion to her husband. Loretta made the assumption that the man had some kind of mistress that he didn't want to tell her about, but the man didn't expect to hear that. Then she continued to just calmly stare into the water and didn't want to hear any words from her husband. He didn't want to laugh at such words anymore and explained normally that he had never had a mistress, and he didn't intend to have one either. After that, he wanted them to never return to this issue again because he considered himself a free man.